In our last lesson, we talked about and finished up the idea of a long-range plan. We know the subject with our 4 R's. We've researched it. We've reasoned through it. We have we've related it, and we wrote down all of that. And so we know our subject well. And then we went and developed an outline. We thought through as much as we could every subject that's related, every idea that's related to our subject, and figured out how long it would take to teach, condensed that down into the number of days we have, and determined a title, a lesson title for each day, and a leading idea. And those leading ideas, what we're trying to accomplish that day, is going to govern what we do in class. And now we're going to talk today, or in this lesson, about mid and short-range planning. So mid-range planning and short-range planning. We're going from the assumption that we have behind us what we've talked about in the previous lessons. We know our subject, and we have this general outline. We know what we're going to teach each day. What do we do now? We're coming into school, and the next 3 weeks we're going to be covering, if we're in Hebrew history, we're going to be covering Abraham. We're going to be covering the patriarchs, let's say. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph is going to take us 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. So in this range, that's our mid-range out there. And then short-range planning is going to be, what am I going to teach tomorrow? What's going to be in my lessons, what are going to be in my lessons for this week, or something like that. So just to get it in a frame of mind, mid-range is kind of like unit planning, we might call it. Unit planning, which is not the subject, but it's not the day. It's that in-between. And then short-range planning is going to be the day-to-day planning. Now, in our mid-range and short-range planning, there are 4 areas that we want to be aware of and think about in this lesson. The first is objectives. And I'm going to give you the 4 of them, and then we'll come back and talk about them. So first is objectives. Second is the content. Third is the strategies. And the fourth is materials and resources. All right, so then to put that in different language, if I'm going to teach, today I'm teaching. I need to know why I'm teaching. What am I trying to accomplish in this class period? That's going to be answered by my objectives, right? And then I need to teach something. What am I going to teach? That's the content. That's what I'm going to deliver to you as students. So that's my content. I have an objective, and I have to deliver. Part of that objective is to get some content to you. To give you something. Then the strategies is how am I going to get this content to you? Am I going to hide it around the room and let you discover it? Am I going to tell a story? Am I going to stand here and give you an outline? Am I going to talk and let you try to figure out an outline? Are we going to have problems? In a math class, I might just put a problem and talk my way through solving the problem, and then see if other students understand things, point out problems, difficulties they might have as they try to solve the problem. That's the strategy. That's the idea of strategy. How do I deliver the content? And then materials and resources. What will I use to help in that? Or what can I use to help with that? Or what can I supply to reinforce that? So, first is formulating the objectives, or discovering the objectives. Many times, I'm taking this from the viewpoint of having to create everything. But a lot of work has been done in this area already. So you might have a textbook. Your principal might say, you stick with that. You have enough to do with everything else. Don't worry about doing too much. Just stick with the textbook. Well, the textbook, if it's a good textbook, is going to have objectives there. So we want to know what those objectives are. We want to understand what an objective is, study it. So in that sense, we don't have to create the objective. We don't have to formulate it, but we should recognize what it is. That way we can understand, okay, so the book is trying to accomplish this. The book is going to help me most if I decide that that's what I'm trying to accomplish too. Now, sometimes it might be that there's something else there that is just really important, and you have a parallel, maybe we'd say, objective also. But we want to recognize the objectives that are there or formulate some. And we've talked about what objectives are. There's the performance objectives, which are mostly knowledge and fact-based. And then there's the two-tiered objectives that are more designed to help us with understanding or help us teach topics of understanding and application. But if there's something that is, for something to be recognizable, it really has to be something that's just able to be performed. And so in a certain sense, those two-tiered objectives, we accept something that's been done that we can recognize as evidence that something deeper is happening in the student's mind. But anyway, we have those objectives. We have the idea of objectives. We need to plan some. And so these objectives need to be appropriate for the ability and development of our students. If we're teaching 7th and 8th graders, and we're teaching a subject that they have had before, okay? So Hebrew history, pretty much they've had Bible stories and all that. There might be something in there they haven't heard before, but almost all that subject is something they have before. So they should already have the foundation. They should already know a lot of facts there. Our objectives then should be related to showing connections between things. We shouldn't necessarily, with 7th and 8th graders, be trying to get them to remember a ton of new facts. Again, not that we won't teach them something that they've never heard before, and not that they shouldn't know the facts, but we can kind of work toward them already knowing the facts and teaching them, maybe seeing the time distance between David and Solomon or between the judges. Showing chronology, that's relationship. How much time between when they left Egypt and when Solomon became king. Those types of things, that's relationships, and that's going to be way more interesting for a 7th and 8th grader than just knowing information. So our objectives need to be appropriate for their ability and for their stage in their development. And they should be appropriately high. We should want to accomplish something with them. We should want to be pushing them towards something, but then appropriately high. Not too high. We don't want it so high that no one can reach it, but we don't want it so low that everybody can reach it, that we all get it on the first day. Okay, so that's our objectives. The next thing that we're going to think about with our mid-range and particularly our immediate short-range planning is the content. Now, if we have a textbook, we might just think, well, I'm just going to teach what's in the textbook. But probably all of you have had teachers that just read or just taught what was in the textbook, and that wasn't a very interesting class. So hopefully maybe you start with the textbook, and maybe some days, you're the volleyball coach and you had a game and there's all kinds of stuff going on, and it was a Wednesday night, and so you had church and a game and all that, and there wasn't much, and so the day after that you teach from the textbook. But hopefully there's more days where you can add a little bit to the content than just, anybody can read a book. So it's nice you're a better teacher if you can add stuff to it. So what should we add? How do we pick content? Well, we want 4 things to remember with our content. First, we want it to be appropriate. Okay? And I don't mean appropriate as in, sometimes we think of the word appropriate as, wow, you shouldn't have, that was inappropriate. Not in that sense. But it does need to be appropriate to our objectives. if I'm wanting to teach the connections, or I'm trying to show a cause and effect. Let's say I'm trying to show cause and effect. I could get some content that's unrelated to the cause or the effect, couldn't I? It could be from, let's put it in history, it could be from the same time period. It could be perhaps interesting, but it's not related to what I'm trying to teach. So I want to, when I'm selecting my content, it needs to be appropriate to what I'm trying, appropriate to my objectives. It needs to be appropriate to the ability level and development of the students. You know, I could have something, but you know just by looking at the way something is produced or published, you know, it's got giant print and all in big pictures. You know, that's probably not designed for 7th and 8th graders, right? So we want something appropriate to their ability, appropriate to the pace. Okay, that might be related to objectives, but if I have, I don't want to cover too much at one time, or I don't want to go too slowly. It needs, the content that I have needs to fit into the pace of what we're doing. We're going somewhere with this class. And the emphasis, and that's related to the first thing I said. So appropriate. So content needs to be appropriate to those things. Then it needs to be current and accurate as much as possible. You've probably, maybe you haven't, but you may have been in a library and seen an encyclopedia or a map, and the map shows the USSR on it. Have you seen a map with the USSR on it? Okay, so I'm not that old. You've at least seen one, okay? But the USSR ceased to exist probably before you guys were born, right? About 1991 or 93, somewhere in there. Okay? So it didn't even exist. Now, it's a fact of history that it did exist in the past, and there's no problem with seeing one, but could you imagine being in history class today and your map and you're doing European geography and there's the USSR? Well, if the USSR is still there, there's a whole bunch of other countries that are really in existence now that aren't there. So we want our content, that's a blatant example, but we want our content to be current and accurate. Current and accurate. Then the content should follow a logical sequence. When we're presenting our content, it should come logically. We don't want to just be all over the map, to use a certain term. To go back to our example we used in our last lesson with Hebrew history, we said we have like key documents and key important people and all that. But then I said we're not going to just go through all the institutions first and then go through all the documents, because that doesn't make sense. There's not a logical sequence there. We like to have those categories, but it makes more sense to go chronologically from Abraham and on. And as we're talking about Abraham, we're going to talk about the Abrahamic covenant. We might talk about Egypt. We might. He goes down in Egypt. Maybe we won't, but maybe we'll talk about the Canaanite cultures, because he lived in Canaan as a sojourner, really. Okay, so we're going to talk about different things. We want our content, we're going to deliver our content in a logical sequence. But I will say, there's a term called necessary antecedents. Antecedent, remember what in English what an antecedent is? Pronouns have an antecedent. Do you remember now? If we have a pronoun, antecedent is what it refers to. It comes before it. Okay. So, necessary antecedents is a phrase that means there are some things that have to come first. And the reason I talk about this here is there's some content that's really hard to learn. And so we might think, well, let's put that later. But it might just be that all that other stuff, it's hard to learn because it needs to be first, and that's what makes the rest of the stuff easier to learn. We can't if we get it out of order, then the other things are going to be hard to learn, and maybe even impossible, because we haven't learned that first thing that is kind of hard to learn. So logical sequence doesn't always mean from easiest to hardest, even though that makes sense in most cases. We will start with the easy stuff and build on it. You know, in mathematics, you say, well, I'm going to start with this concept, and then we're going to add to it, not going to start at the end. and try to teach it all at once. But some things do need to be taught first that are harder to be learned. That's what necessary antecedents refers to. Then it's nice, or it's best, we would say, if our content can come from multiple sources. So 4 things about content: appropriate, current and accurate, logical sequence, and multiple sources. And that's where I'm saying we could, if we have to, just use the textbook. But if we have more sources than the textbook, that makes school a lot more interesting. And in a certain sense, it makes it more reliable, because we're not just getting one person's word for it. Now, one person can be pretty trustworthy as long as he has documented his sources, okay? But it's just nicer to have, and better if possible, to have multiple sources. Okay, so we have our objectives and our content, and then the third thing that we're thinking about: how am I going to teach this in class tomorrow or on Wednesday, how are we going to say it? How are we going to teach this is our strategies. And that is the how. How am I going to deliver the content? All right, so there are 3 things about the strategies that we should think about. And one of them has 3 things involved with it, and it's the first one. So the first thing with the strategy, how am I going to teach this? I want to provide, when I teach, I want to provide sufficient opportunities for. So if you're writing that down, just put sufficient opportunities for, and then put a colon, and we have 3 things under that. And these 3 will make sense when I say them. First is initial learning, learning something new. Application and practice, how do I use what you just taught me, or how do you use what I just taught you? And then review. So if we have a lesson in, a lesson in English grammar, here's the new concept, this is how we use it, and here's the review. This is how it fits into what we knew before. This is, and application is review somewhat, but so in our strategy, how am I going to teach this? I want to provide sufficient opportunities to learn stuff new, initial learning, apply what we've learned or practice it, and then review. So strategy needs to provide those opportunities, and then secondly, needs to engage the students in the instruction. Actively engage the students. And here, as much as possible, we want everybody actively engaged. And to me, one of the best ways to actively engage students is to ask questions. This is it's a method, and if you ask the questions in the right manner, then you can keep everybody involved. If I ask questions and always ask the same person to answer my questions, then not everybody's actively involved. But if I ask questions in a certain manner so that everybody feels like they might have to answer it, their mind is involved and they're participating, they're actively participating. And we're going to be speaking about that in a future lesson. So our strategy, we want a strategy that provides sufficient opportunities to learn, practice, and review, that actively engages the students, that's the second one, and then 3, that promotes varied levels of thinking and problem-solving skills. So the third thing we want our strategy to do is promote varied levels. We want to work with knowledge, but we also want them to think with analysis or application, comprehension, synthesis, all those varied levels of knowledge and thinking skills. We think on different levels. If our strategy can get them thinking on many different levels, it's obviously that does make it more interesting, but it's helpful to exercise them at different levels as we're teaching. All right, so we have objectives, content, strategies, and then the last thing is our materials and resources. And specifically, we'll say select, adapt, or develop materials, resources, and technologies which help present the content. Select, adapt, or develop. So there's three options there. We could find something that works. We could find something that's close and adapt it. Or we may just say, I can't find anything that's close and have to develop it ourselves, right? Create it. And what is it? It's a material. So we might be creating a material, or we might be selecting or adapting a resource or a technology that helps us to present the content. So select, adapt, or develop materials, resources, and technologies which will present the content. It's best if we can have a variety of formats. I'm thinking, as we get older, we need less variety. But if you're teaching 3rd and 4th grade and the only thing you ever do is on the chalkboard, then you have a lot of room for improvement. Even if you just take what you would have put on the chalkboard and put it on a visual that you can carry around and use in different spots, there's some variety there. Technology, and when we use we can make this statement before the advent of our digital technology. But with digital technology, there's even more technologies available to us. For one, there's the chalkboard. That's technology. Chalk. Pen and paper is technology. Overhead projector. I don't know if you know what that is. But when you shoot something on the board, I saw somebody, and this is a great use of technology. They had the sentences for diagramming written on a transparency. So they shot the sentence on the chalkboard, and the students could do whatever they were doing, diagramming or identifying parts, and then boom, quickly erase it, and the next sentence comes up on the board because it's on. So writing the sentence out on the board was kind of immediate because it was sent from the projector in the back. And then, of course, we have our digital technologies today, even with devices like iPads or computers and stuff like that. That technology is not... just because you use a special technology doesn't mean that your students will learn better. Our current culture thinks that every classroom has to have an iPad, or a one-to-one is what they call a device, one device per student. So everybody has a Chromebook or an iPad, and everything has to be done with the new technology. And new technology is not bad. It doesn't hurt in one sense. Most people, when they get out of school, are going to be using the new technology in their work in some way or another. Some a tremendous amount, some not so much. So that doesn't hurt, but it's not the only thing. And all kinds of technologies are available to us, and we should use them as much as possible. The more variety we have, the more interesting our class is going to be. And it's important for our students to be able to pay attention. If they can pay attention with interest, they're going to learn better what we're talking about. And that's one of our laws of learning from Gregory. Then, these resources or technologies and materials want to help us explain what we're talking about, maybe give examples of what we're teaching, or give a demonstration of what we're trying to teach. That's another thing, just ways to think. Can I find something that is a demonstration of this, or is there an example I can find? So that's if I can find something, that's selecting, right, a resource. All right, and then always, let me just say this. This relates to the previous lesson we had and to this lesson. We always want to be revising and adjusting our plans as needed. It's one thing to say, well, this is my plan, I'm sticking with it. Well, we get into a day and the students don't understand anything. We're going to have to slow down, back up, rework it, and then we need to revise and adjust. And then we get through a semester, let's say, and it didn't go the way we thought it would go on our overview plan, the long-range plan. We need to make adjustments, whether we need to say, well, these kids are understanding, I'm going way faster than I wanted to, or I'm having a hard time, or I need to go slower, I assumed too much, whatever. Either way, or I just like to talk a lot. We need to be careful with that. That we can discipline. We can change that some. But we always shouldn't say, well, that's the plan, I can't change it. You created the plan, figure it out, make it work. If you're not working it yourself, change yourself. If the plan is too hard to work, adjust the plan. You created it. So whether it's the long-range plan or mid-range planning, short-range planning, we always should be revising and adjusting so that and the more we adjust in the short range, the less we'll have to adjust in the mid-range and the long range, because we can make those adjustments from time to time and keep ourselves in the large plan. All right, so mid and short range planning includes these 4 basic areas: objectives, content, strategies, and materials and resources.